Welcome to Part 7 of the CISA series. Up to this point, we've covered all 5 CISA domains, exploring everything from auditing processes and governance through to operations, resilience, and the protection of information assets. In this part of the journey, the focus shifts away from simply learning concepts and moves toward preparing for the exam itself. We'll be looking at how the CISA exam is structured, how scenario-based questions are presented, and most importantly, how to think like the exam. One of the biggest challenges candidates face is that the exam is not purely technical and it is not based on memorization alone. Instead, the questions are designed to test judgment, risk awareness, governance understanding, and the ability to identify the best answer in a real-world scenario. Throughout this section, we'll work through exam strategy, common question patterns, high-impact topics, and practical examples designed to help you approach the exam with greater confidence. The goal is not just to recognize keywords, but to understand how auditors think, how risks are evaluated, and how governance, controls, and business impact influence decision-making. So, let's begin preparing for the final step in the CISA journey, learning how to approach the exam with the mindset of an IS auditor. Before we jump into the exam preparation and practice questions, let's take a quick step back and look at the full journey we've covered throughout this CISA series. We started with Part 1, where we introduced the CISA certification itself, what the exam is about, how it is structured, and the mindset needed to approach it successfully. From there, we moved into Domain 1, the information systems auditing process. This is really the foundation of the certification, covering risk-based auditing, audit planning, evidence collection, testing techniques, and reporting. Next, we explored Domain 2, Governance and Management of IT, where the focus shifted to governance structures, strategic alignment, risk management, and understanding the difference between governance responsibilities and operational management. In Part 4, we covered Domain 3, Information Systems Acquisition, Development, and Implementation. That included system development, testing approaches, project governance, requirements management, and change control processes. We then moved into Domain 4, Operations and Business Resilience, looking at operational controls, monitoring, incident management, disaster recovery, and business continuity planning. After that, we covered Domain 5, Protection of Information Assets, which focused heavily on security concepts such as identity and access management, encryption, security monitoring, incident response, and protecting organizational data. And now we arrive at Part 7, Exam Practice and Revision. This final section is all about bringing the domains together, understanding how the exam tests your thinking, and learning how to approach scenario-based questions with the mindset of an IS auditor. The goal of this series has never been simple memorization. It has been about understanding risk, governance, controls, business impact, and how auditors evaluate real-world situations. So now, let's move into the final stage of the journey and start applying everything we've covered throughout the series. In this part of the series, we'll shift our focus from learning the individual domains to understanding how to approach the CISA exam itself. We'll begin by looking at how the exam works, including the structure of the questions, the scoring model, and what the exam is really designed to test. From there, we'll explore the domain weightings so you can understand where the majority of the marks are concentrated and how to prioritize your study efforts more effectively. Now that we've reached the final part of the series, let's take a look at what we'll be covering throughout this exam preparation section. We'll begin by understanding how the CISA exam actually works, including the structure of the questions, how the exam tests judgment, and why many questions are designed around real-world scenarios rather than simple memorization. From there, we'll look at the domain weighting so you can clearly see where the strongest exam focus areas are and how to prioritize your revision time more effectively. We'll also work through question approach techniques, focusing on how to analyze scenarios, identify keywords such as first, best, most, and primary, and eliminate weaker answer options logically. Another important area we'll cover is common mistakes candidates make during the exam. In many cases, learners understand the technical content but still choose the wrong answer because they focus on technology instead of governance, risk, or business impact. And finally, We'll look at overall exam strategy, including pacing, time management, confidence during the exam, and how to think like an auditor when approaching difficult questions. The objective of this part is not simply to memorize information, but to develop the judgment and mindset needed to approach the CISA exam successfully. Before we get into question techniques and exam strategy, it's important to understand how the CISA exam itself is structured. The exam consists of 150 multiple-choice questions that must be completed within 4 hours. That means time management becomes extremely important, especially because many of the questions are scenario-based and require careful reading. Another key point is that every question has one best answer. In many cases, more than one option may appear technically correct, but the exam is designed to test judgment and prioritization. Your task is to identify the answer that best aligns with audit principles, governance, risk management, and business impact. The good news is that there is no negative marking, so it is always better to answer every question rather than leave questions blank. Even if you are unsure, eliminating weaker answers can significantly improve your chances of selecting the correct option. One of the biggest misconceptions about the CISA exam is that it is based purely on memorization. In reality, the exam focuses far more on judgment, analysis, and understanding how auditors think in real-world situations. That means success comes from understanding concepts, recognizing risk, evaluating controls, and approaching questions from a business and governance perspective rather than purely a technical one. Another important area to understand before sitting the exam is how the CISA scoring model works. The exam uses a scaled scoring system, with scores ranging from 200 to 800 points. To pass the exam, a candidate must achieve a scaled score of 450 or higher. One thing that often confuses candidates is that this is not a simple percentage-based scoring system. Your final result is scaled, meaning ISACA adjusts scoring to ensure consistency across different exam versions and difficulty levels. What this means in practice is that you should not become overly focused on calculating exact percentages during your preparation. Instead, the goal should be to build consistent understanding across all 5 domains and develop strong judgment when answering scenario-based questions. Another important point is that the exam is assessed using your total overall score. You do not need to pass every individual domain separately. Strong performance in one area can help offset weaker performance in another. This is why understanding the domain weightings and focusing on the high-impact topics can significantly improve your chances of success. Ultimately, the scoring model rewards balanced knowledge, risk-based thinking, and the ability to consistently identify the best answer from an auditor's perspective. Understanding the domain weightings is extremely important when preparing for the CISA exam because it helps you prioritize where to spend the majority of your study time and revision effort. As you can see, domains 4 and 5 carry the highest weighting at 26% each. That means more than half of the entire exam is focused on information systems operations and business resilience, together with the protection of information assets. Domain 4 focuses heavily on operational controls, incident management, disaster recovery, business continuity, resilience, and recovery processes. Domain 5 then builds on that by focusing on security concepts such as identity and access management, monitoring, encryption, incident response, and data protection. Domains 1 and 2 each carry 18% of the exam. Domain 1 covers the information systems auditing process, including audit planning, evidence collection, risk-based auditing, and reporting. Domain 2 focuses on governance and management of IT, including governance structures, risk management, policies, and alignment between IT and business objectives. Domain 3 carries the lowest weighting at 12%, but that does not mean it should be ignored. Questions in this domain are often more detailed and scenario-driven, especially around requirements, testing, project governance, and change management. One important thing to remember is that the weightings do not just tell you how many questions may appear from each domain. They also give you insight into where ISACA places the strongest emphasis from a professional and practical perspective. For many candidates, focusing revision time according to these weightings can significantly improve exam readiness and confidence going into the exam. So, What do these weightings actually mean for you as a candidate preparing for the exam? The first major takeaway is that domains 4 and 5 together make up more than half of the entire CISA exam, accounting for 52% of the total weighting. That means areas such as operations, resilience, incident management, business continuity, access control, security monitoring, and protection of information assets should receive a significant portion of your study time. At the same time, domains 1 and 2 provide the foundation for how the exam thinks. These domains establish the audit mindset, governance principles, risk-based thinking, and the relationship between business objectives, controls, and audit activities. Even when questions appear technical, the underlying logic often comes back to governance, risk, and audit judgment. Domain 3 carries a lower weighting, but it remains important. Questions in this area are often detailed and scenario-driven, especially around requirements, testing, project governance, and change management. A smaller weighting does not mean the questions are easier or less important. One of the biggest mistakes candidates make is trying to study every topic equally. A much more effective approach is to understand where the strongest exam focus areas are and allocate revision time accordingly. Ultimately, the goal is to focus where the marks are while still maintaining balanced understanding across all 5 domains. One of the biggest mindset shifts needed for the CISA exam is learning how to think like an auditor rather than a technician or engineer. When approaching questions, your focus should always be on risk, controls, and business impact. The exam is constantly testing whether you can identify where the real risk exists, how effective the controls are, and what impact a weakness could have on the organization. A common mistake candidates make is falling into technical-first thinking. Many questions include technical details intentionally designed to distract you. In many cases, the technically advanced answer is not the best answer from an audit or governance perspective. Instead, you should prioritize governance, process, oversight, and risk management. The exam often rewards answers that strengthen process control, improve governance, or reduce business risk rather than purely technical solutions. Another important point is that your answers should reflect the mindset of an auditor. An engineer may focus on fixing systems immediately, while an auditor focuses on understanding risk, evaluating controls, identifying root causes, and ensuring proper governance and accountability are in place. Throughout the exam, constantly ask yourself, what is the risk? What control best addresses that risk? What has the greatest business impact? What would an auditor prioritize first? Developing this mindset is one of the most important factors in passing the CISA exam successfully. One of the simplest but most powerful ways to approach the CISA exam is to follow what I like to call the golden rule of audit thinking. When reading any scenario, always train yourself to think logically through the relationship between threats, risks, and controls. Start by identifying the threat or issue being described in the scenario. Then ask yourself what risk that threat creates for the organization. Once you understand the risk, the next step is to determine which control would best reduce, prevent, detect, or manage that risk. In many CISA questions, the correct answer becomes much clearer once you apply this thought process consistently. Another important skill is learning how to map scenarios to controls logically. The exam is not simply testing whether you recognize terminology. It is testing whether you can connect a business problem to the most appropriate control or audit response. For example, if a scenario describes excessive access rights, you should immediately begin thinking about risks such as unauthorized access, segregation of duties, and least privilege controls. If a scenario describes system downtime, your thinking should move toward resilience, recovery priorities, business impact, and continuity controls. The more you practice this structured approach, the more naturally you will begin to recognize patterns within the exam questions. And ultimately, that is one of the keys to success in CISA, learning to think through scenarios logically rather than trying to memorize isolated facts. As you work through CISA questions, there are several recurring priorities that appear again and again throughout the exam. Understanding these patterns can help you eliminate weaker answers much more quickly. The first priority is governance over purely technical solutions. The exam often favors answers that improve governance, oversight, accountability, or process management rather than answers focused only on technical fixes. In many scenarios, the technically advanced option is not necessarily the best audit answer. Another common theme is prevention over detection. Preventive controls are generally stronger because they reduce the likelihood of incidents occurring in the first place. However, context still matters, and the best answer always depends on the specific risk and business situation being described. The exam also tends to prioritize process over reaction. Rather than responding only after problems occur, stronger answers usually focus on improving processes, strengthening controls, and addressing root causes before incidents happen again. And finally, nearly every question in the exam is driven by risk-based decision-making. The correct answer is often the one that best reduces business risk, protects critical processes, or aligns with governance and control objectives. As you practice questions, constantly look for these patterns: governance over technical detail, prevention over reaction, process over isolated fixes, and decisions driven by risk and business impact. Recognizing these priorities can significantly improve both speed and accuracy during the exam. To perform well in the CISA exam, it is important to understand what the exam is actually trying to assess. Many candidates focus too heavily on memorizing technical information, when in reality the exam is testing professional judgment and audit thinking. A major focus throughout the exam is risk-based thinking. You need to be able to identify where risk exists, understand the potential business impact, and determine which controls or actions best reduce that risk. The exam also places strong emphasis on control effectiveness. It is not enough to know that a control exists. You must understand whether the control is properly designed, whether it is operating effectively, and whether it addresses the underlying risk appropriately. Governance understanding is another key theme that appears repeatedly throughout the exam. Questions often test whether you understand accountability, oversight, policy direction, strategic alignment, and the difference between governance responsibilities and operational activities. Audit judgment is equally important. In many scenarios, multiple answers may appear technically correct, but the best answer is usually the one that aligns most closely with risk reduction, governance principles, business objectives, and sound audit practice. And finally, it is important to remember that the exam is not testing deep technical depth. You are not expected to configure systems, troubleshoot infrastructure, or operate as a security engineer. Instead, the focus is on understanding concepts, evaluating controls, assessing risk, and making sound professional decisions from an auditor's perspective. As you prepare for the CISA exam, there are certain areas that consistently receive stronger focus and are tested in far greater detail than others. These are the high-impact topics that candidates should prioritize during revision. One of the most important areas is risk-based auditing, particularly across domains 1 and 2. This forms the foundation of the audit process and appears repeatedly throughout the exam. You need to understand audit risk, risk assessment, control evaluation, audit planning, and how to link risk to appropriate audit procedures and controls. Controls are also heavily tested across all domains. The exam frequently assesses whether you can identify the most effective control for a given risk scenario, including preventive, detective, corrective, and compensating controls. Governance and management of IT in Domain 2 is another critical area. Questions often focus on governance structures, accountability, policies, oversight responsibilities, and alignment between IT and business objectives. Business impact and resilience, covered in Domain 4, is heavily weighted and highly scenario-driven. You should be comfortable with concepts such as business impact analysis, recovery priorities, disaster recovery planning, business continuity, and operational resilience. Identity and access management in Domain 5 is one of the most tested technical areas. This includes authentication, authorization, least privilege, segregation of duties, single sign-on risks, and access control effectiveness. Security monitoring and incident response are also major focus areas in Domain 5. Candidates should understand logging, monitoring, CM concepts, incident handling, and the correct sequence of the incident response lifecycle. Systems development and testing from domain the 3rd of May carry a lower weighting overall, but the questions are often detailed and judgment-focused. Requirements management, testing approaches, change management, and project controls are especially important. Data protection and encryption are regularly tested conceptually and in applied scenarios. You should understand the purpose of encryption, hashing, digital signatures, and the difference between protecting confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Audit evidence and techniques in Domain 1 is another core topic area. This includes evidence reliability, sampling, inquiry versus observation, and understanding what constitutes sufficient and appropriate audit evidence. And finally, underlying all of these domains is the concept of business processes. One of the hidden themes throughout the CISA exam is that risk exists in processes, not systems alone. The strongest answers are usually those that connect business process risk to governance, controls, and business impact. One of the most important topics in the entire CISA exam is risk-based auditing. This concept forms the foundation of how auditors approach planning, testing, and decision-making throughout the audit process. At its core, risk-based auditing means that audit effort should be driven by risk and business impact, not by convenience, equal coverage, or purely technical concerns. Auditors focus their attention on the areas that could have the greatest effect on the organization if controls fail. There are several key concepts you must understand in this area. The first is inherent risk, which represents the level of risk that exists before controls are applied. Control risk refers to the possibility that existing controls may fail to prevent or detect problems. And detection risk is the risk that the auditor's procedures may fail to identify an issue that already exists. You also need to understand how these concepts connect to audit planning and audit coverage decisions. The exam frequently tests whether you can determine where audit attention should be focused based on risk and business impact. Another critical area is understanding the relationship between risk, controls, and audit procedures. Auditors identify risks, evaluate the controls intended to manage those risks, and then design audit procedures to determine whether those controls are effective. This topic is heavily scenario-based in the exam. Questions often ask what the auditor should do first, what the best action would be, or which risk or control is most significant in a given situation. A very important exam principle is that auditors should understand the risk before evaluating controls. The exam also tends to prioritize high-risk areas, and many questions test whether you understand the correct sequence of audit activities and risk assessment steps. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that auditing is not about checking everything equally. It is about identifying what matters most to the organization and focusing audit effort where the greatest risks exist. Controls are one of the most heavily tested concepts across the entire CISA exam, and this is an area where many scenario-based questions are focused. One important thing to understand is that the exam is not simply testing whether you can memorize control definitions. Instead, it focuses on how controls are applied in real-world situations and whether they effectively reduce risk to an acceptable level. You must be comfortable with the main categories of controls. Preventive controls are designed to stop incidents before they occur. Examples include access controls, multi-factor authentication, and segregation of duties. Detective controls identify issues after they occur. These include logging, monitoring, alerts, and audit trails. Corrective controls focus on restoring systems or reducing the impact after an incident. Examples include backups, disaster recovery plans, and patching activities. Another important concept is compensating controls. These are alternative controls implemented when the preferred or primary control is not feasible, but equivalent risk reduction is still required. The exam also tests control effectiveness. This includes understanding the difference between design effectiveness, whether the control is appropriate in theory, and operating effectiveness, whether the control is functioning consistently in practice. One of the most critical skills in the exam is matching the right control to the right risk. This means first understanding the risk being described, and then selecting the most effective control to address that specific exposure. Many questions present a scenario with a weakness or risk and ask you to identify the best control, not simply a technically correct one. There are also several common exam traps in this area. Candidates often select detective controls when a preventive control would reduce the risk earlier. Others choose controls that do not directly address the root risk being described, or they ignore compensating controls entirely. A very important exam principle is that preventive controls are generally stronger because they reduce risk before incidents occur. However, the best answer still depends on the business context, the specific scenario, and the level of risk involved. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that the exam is not asking, "What is a control?" It is asking, "What is the best control for this specific situation?" Governance and management of IT is one of the most important conceptual areas within the CISA exam, particularly in Domain 2. This topic is tested less from a technical perspective and far more from a strategic, governance, and accountability viewpoint. A major focus throughout this area is understanding who is responsible for what within the organization. You must clearly understand the difference between governance responsibilities and management responsibilities. Governance is typically performed by the board or executive leadership and focuses on direction, oversight, accountability, and ensuring IT supports business objectives. Management, on the other hand, focuses on implementation, execution, operations, and day-to-day activities. Another important principle is that policies should always be driven by risk. Policies are not created based on convenience, tools, or technology alone. Instead, they should be developed based on business objectives, risk assessments, regulatory requirements, and organizational priorities. The exam also places strong emphasis on alignment between IT and the business. IT should support business goals, enable value delivery, improve strategic alignment, and contribute to organizational outcomes. Many governance concepts are also indirectly influenced by COBIT principles. Although the exam may not explicitly ask detailed COBIT framework questions, concepts such as governance versus management, value delivery, risk management, resource optimization, and performance measurement appear regularly throughout governance scenarios. This topic is heavily scenario-based in the exam. Questions often ask, who is responsible? What the most important action is? Or what should happen first from a governance perspective? A common exam pattern is that the correct answer is usually related to governance, oversight, accountability, or alignment with business objectives rather than purely operational or technical actions. There are also several common traps in this area. Candidates often confuse governance responsibilities with operational management tasks, or they choose technically correct solutions instead of strategic governance-focused decisions. One of the most important principles to remember is, governance sets direction. Management executes that direction. Understanding that distinction is critical for many CISA questions in Domain 2. Business impact and resilience is one of the highest weighted and most heavily tested areas within the CISA exam, particularly in Domain 4. A major theme throughout this topic is that the focus is on maintaining business operations, not simply restoring technology. One of the most important concepts in this area is the business impact analysis, or BIA. The BIA identifies critical business processes, evaluates the impact of disruptions, and determines recovery priorities based on business needs. This is important because recovery decisions should always be driven by business impact rather than technical convenience. You also need to understand the difference between RTO and RPO. The Recovery Time Objective, or RTO, defines how quickly systems or services must be restored after a disruption. The Recovery Point Objective, or RPO, defines how much data loss the organization is willing to tolerate. Another key distinction is the difference between disaster recovery planning and business continuity planning. Disaster recovery focuses primarily on restoring IT systems and infrastructure, while business continuity focuses on maintaining or restoring critical business operations as a whole. Recovery priorities are another heavily tested area. The exam frequently assesses whether candidates understand that recovery sequencing should be based on business criticality and operational impact, not necessarily on which systems are easiest or fastest to recover. This topic is very scenario-driven in the exam. Questions often ask, what is most important? What should be recovered first? Or what factors should drive recovery priorities? A very common exam pattern is that the correct answer is usually related to business impact, critical business processes, or organizational priorities rather than purely technical recovery considerations. There are also several common traps in this area. Candidates often focus too heavily on technology instead of business needs, confuse disaster recovery with business continuity, or prioritize the fastest recovery rather than the most critical process. One of the most important principles to remember is that technology supports the business, not the other way around. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that recovery is not about restoring systems alone. It is about restoring the organization's ability to continue critical business operations. Identity and access management is one of the most important and heavily tested areas in Domain 5 of the CISA exam. The focus here is not only on security technology, but on controlling who can access what, when they can access it, and what level of access they should have. One of the core concepts you must master is the difference between authentication and authorization. Authentication verifies identity, in other words, confirming who the user is. Authorization determines permissions, what that user is allowed to access or perform once authenticated. This distinction is tested frequently in the exam and is a very common source of confusion for candidates. Another major topic area is multi-factor authentication and single sign-on. Multi-factor authentication strengthens security by requiring more than one form of verification before access is granted. This significantly reduces the risk of compromised credentials being used successfully. Single sign-on, or SSO, improves usability and user convenience because users authenticate once and gain access to multiple systems. However, the exam frequently highlights the trade-off that SSO centralizes risk. If a single account is compromised, multiple systems may be exposed at the same time. Least privilege is another critical principle tested repeatedly throughout Domain 5. Users should only have the minimum access necessary to perform their job functions. This reduces the likelihood of data exposure, insider threats, misuse of privileges, and unauthorized changes. Segregation of duties is equally important. No single individual should have complete end-to-end control over critical business processes. This helps reduce fraud risk, prevents abuse of authority, and strengthens oversight and accountability. Questions in this area are usually scenario-based and often focus on identifying access-related risks, recognizing excessive privileges, or selecting the best control to reduce exposure. One of the biggest exam traps in this domain is choosing convenience over security. The exam consistently prioritizes risk reduction and access control effectiveness over usability or operational convenience. Another common trap is underestimating the danger of excessive access rights. Excessive privilege is considered one of the most significant security risks in many environments because it increases the potential impact of compromised accounts or insider misuse. A very important exam mindset is to prioritize least privilege, strong access control, segregation of duties, and reduction of unnecessary access. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that while strong authentication is important, properly controlling and limiting access is what truly protects organizational information assets and reduces business risk. Security monitoring and incident response is another critical area within Domain 5, and it is very heavily tested through real-world scenario questions. This topic focuses on how organizations detect security events, respond to incidents, contain threats, and restore operations effectively. One of the key concepts in this area is understanding the difference between prevention and detection. Preventive controls aim to reduce the likelihood of incidents occurring in the first place. However, the exam assumes that not all attacks can be prevented, which is why detective controls and monitoring capabilities are so important. Detective controls help organizations identify incidents quickly, trigger alerts, and provide visibility into suspicious activity. This is where logging and monitoring become critical. You should also understand the role of CM systems, security information and event management solutions. CM platforms centralize logs from multiple systems, correlate events, detect anomalies, and generate alerts for potential security incidents. The exam frequently emphasizes that visibility is essential for effective incident response. Another extremely important area is the incident response lifecycle, and the sequence of steps is heavily tested in the exam. The correct order matters. The first step is detection, identifying suspicious activity and recognizing that an incident may be occurring. Next comes containment, where the goal is to limit the spread of the incident and isolate affected systems to reduce damage. After containment comes eradication, which focuses on removing the root cause of the incident, such as malware, compromised accounts, or vulnerabilities. The final stage is recovery, where systems and business operations are restored and normal functioning is validated. Questions in this domain are very scenario-based and often ask, what should be done first? What is the next step? Or what the best response would be in a given situation. There are also several common exam traps in this area. Candidates often jump straight to eradication before properly containing the incident, which can allow the attack to spread further. Another common mistake is choosing preventive controls when the scenario clearly describes an active incident that already requires detection and response activities. The exam also frequently tests whether candidates understand the importance of logging and monitoring. Without visibility, organizations cannot effectively detect, investigate, or respond to threats. One of the most important principles to remember is, you cannot respond to what you cannot detect, and you must contain an incident before attempting to eliminate it. Systems development and testing is covered in Domain 3 of the CISA exam. Although this domain carries a lower weighting compared to some of the others, the questions are often tested in greater depth and are heavily focused on judgment and root cause analysis. A major theme throughout this domain is understanding why systems fail, not simply how systems are built. One of the most critical concepts in this entire domain is requirements management. Requirements form the foundation of successful systems development. If requirements are incomplete, unclear, inaccurate, or poorly understood, problems will continue throughout design, development, testing, and implementation. The exam frequently treats requirements issues as the root cause of many system failures. This is an extremely important exam pattern to recognize. You also need to understand the different types of testing. Unit testing focuses on testing individual components and is usually performed by developers. Integration testing ensures that multiple components work together correctly and that systems interact properly as a whole. User acceptance testing, or UAT, validates whether the solution meets business requirements and operational needs from the user's perspective. The exam frequently emphasizes the importance of business user involvement during UAT. Another major topic area is change management. Change management controls ensure that changes are formally requested, approved, tested, documented, and implemented in a controlled manner. The purpose is to reduce the risk of unauthorized changes, operational disruption, and system instability. Questions in this domain are very scenario-driven and often focus on identifying the root cause of system problems. Many questions describe project failures, implementation issues, or testing weaknesses and then ask what the most likely underlying problem is. One of the most common exam patterns is that development problems often trace back to requirements weaknesses rather than technical failures. There are also several common exam traps in this domain. Candidates sometimes focus too heavily on testing activities instead of identifying flawed requirements, or they choose technical fixes without addressing the true root cause of the issue. The exam also frequently tests whether candidates understand the importance of business involvement during user acceptance testing. One important principle to remember is that requirements drive design, development, testing, implementation, and ultimately business success. The key takeaway from this domain is that most major system failures are not purely technical problems. Very often, they begin as requirements failures much earlier in the development lifecycle. Data protection and encryption is another critical area within Domain 5 of the CISA exam. This topic is tested both conceptually and through scenario-based questions, with a strong focus on understanding why a technology is used rather than how it works technically. One of the most important principles in this area is matching the correct technology to the correct security objective. Encryption is primarily used to protect confidentiality. Its purpose is to prevent unauthorized individuals from accessing sensitive information. The exam frequently tests encryption in relation to protecting data at rest, such as information stored in databases or on disks, and data in transit, where information is being transmitted across networks using secure protocols such as TLS. Hashing, on the other hand, is focused on integrity. Hashing helps verify that data has not been altered or tampered with. A key point to remember is that hashing is a one-way process and cannot be reversed back into the original data. Digital signatures combine several important security objectives. They help provide integrity by ensuring the data has not changed, authentication by verifying the sender, and non-repudiation by preventing the sender from denying they originated the message. Another important area is understanding the difference between data at rest and data in transit. Data at rest refers to stored information, while data in transit refers to data actively moving across networks or communication channels. The exam frequently tests whether candidates can apply the correct protection mechanisms to each situation. Questions in this domain are highly scenario-based and usually focus on selecting the correct technology based on the security problem being described. A very common exam pattern is matching confidentiality to encryption, integrity to hashing, and authentication or non-repudiation to digital signatures. There are also several common exam traps in this area. Candidates sometimes confuse hashing with encryption, choose encryption when the scenario is actually testing integrity requirements, or ignore whether the data is at rest or in transit. One of the most important principles to remember is that the exam is not testing deep cryptographic algorithms or mathematical implementation details. Instead, it is testing whether you understand the purpose of the technology, what risk it addresses, and which control best mitigates that risk. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that the CISA exam does not focus on how encryption works internally. It focuses on when and why encryption or related technologies should be used to protect organizational information assets. Audit evidence and techniques is one of the most important logic-based areas within Domain 1 of the CISA exam. This topic focuses heavily on the quality, reliability, and appropriateness of audit evidence, as well as how that evidence is obtained and evaluated. A major principle throughout this area is understanding the reliability hierarchy of evidence. In general, evidence obtained directly by the auditor is considered the most reliable. This is why the exam frequently follows the principle: auditor evidence is stronger than system evidence, and system evidence is stronger than user statements. Evidence collected directly through auditor observation, independent verification, or direct testing is usually viewed as the strongest form of evidence. System-generated reports can also provide reliable evidence, but only if the auditor has confidence in the underlying system controls and report integrity. User statements and inquiry alone are generally considered the least reliable forms of evidence because they are subjective and may not be independently verified. You also need to understand the different types of audit evidence collection techniques. Inquiry involves asking questions and gathering explanations from personnel, but inquiry alone is not usually sufficient evidence. Observation involves watching processes or controls being performed and is generally more reliable than inquiry because the auditor sees activities directly. Inspection involves reviewing records, documentation, reports, logs, and other forms of evidence to validate whether controls or activities occurred as expected. Another important concept is sampling risk. Sampling risk refers to the possibility that conclusions drawn from a sample may not accurately represent the entire population. The exam frequently tests whether candidates understand the limitations associated with sampling and when additional audit procedures may be required. Questions in this area are heavily scenario-based and often ask: which evidence is most reliable? What the auditor should do next? Or whether sufficient evidence has been obtained to support a conclusion. A common exam pattern is presenting multiple evidence options and asking you to select the strongest or most reliable source of evidence. There are also several common exam traps in this domain. Candidates sometimes treat inquiry alone as sufficient evidence, rely too heavily on unvalidated system reports, or confuse observation with proof that a control operates effectively over time. One of the most important principles to remember is that audit evidence must be sufficient, reliable, relevant, and preferably independently verified. Ultimately, the key takeaway is that the best evidence is not simply what you're told. It is what you can independently verify and validate as an auditor. A hidden theme throughout all 5 CISA domains is that risk does not begin with technology. Risk begins within the way the business operates. Systems and applications are only tools that support business activities. They are not usually the original source of the risk. This is a critical mindset shift for the exam. The key idea here is that risks exist within business processes, not within systems alone. Technology supports and enables processes such as transactions, approvals, reporting, customer service, and operational activities. If the underlying process is weak, poorly designed, or lacks controls, the business remains exposed regardless of how advanced the technology may be. For the auditor, this means always starting with an understanding of the business process first. Before evaluating systems or technical controls, the auditor needs to understand how the process works, where risk exists within the process, what controls are expected, and what business impact could occur if those controls fail. This leads directly into audit thinking. The normal audit flow is process to risk to control to audit procedure. In other words, understand the business activity, identify the associated risks, determine the required controls, and then design audit procedures to test those controls. This is exactly how many CISA questions are structured. Most exam questions are scenario-based. The question may describe a technical issue or a system problem, but the correct answer usually relates to business impact, process weakness, governance, control design, or risk exposure. A common mistake in the exam is focusing immediately on technical fixes. Candidates often select highly technical answers without first understanding the business process or the root cause of the issue. The CISA exam consistently rewards audit judgment over technical detail. Another important point is that business processes drive risk exposure, control requirements, audit scope, and compliance obligations. Technology is simply a supporting layer. The key takeaway from this slide is: do not audit systems in isolation. Audit the business process that the system supports. That business-focused mindset is one of the strongest foundations for success in the CISA exam. One of the most important exam techniques for CISA is learning to identify the keywords that completely change how a question should be answered. These keywords are often the difference between selecting a technically correct answer and selecting the best exam answer. Words like most, best, first, and primary are extremely important in CISA questions and should immediately stand out when reading a scenario. When a question asks for the most important issue, you should focus on the option with the greatest business impact, highest risk, or strongest governance significance. If the question asks for the best answer, remember that several options may be technically correct. Your job is to identify the answer that most effectively addresses the root risk, aligns with audit principles, and provides the strongest overall outcome. When the question asks what should be done first, the focus shifts to sequence and process order. In these questions, understanding audit flow, incident response stages, risk assessment order, or escalation sequence becomes critical. The word primary is also very important because it asks for the main reason, key objective, or underlying purpose behind an action or control. Many candidates lose marks because they focus only on the technical details of the scenario and ignore these keywords entirely. But in reality, these words often determine the entire logic of the question. A useful exam habit is to identify and mentally highlight these keywords before even looking at the answer choices. Doing this helps you approach the question from the correct perspective and reduces the chance of being distracted by technically attractive but weaker answers. Throughout the CISA exam, always train yourself to ask What is the question really asking? Is it asking for priority, sequence, root cause, best overall control, greatest business impact? Recognizing these keywords consistently can significantly improve both accuracy and exam confidence. One of the best ways to improve your performance in the CISA exam is to use a consistent and structured approach for every question you answer. This helps reduce mistakes, improves focus, and prevents candidates from rushing into technically attractive but incorrect answers. The first step is to read the question carefully. Many CISA questions contain extra information designed to distract you, so it is important not to rush. Pay close attention to keywords such as most, best, first, and primary because these words completely change the meaning of the question. The next step is to identify what the question is actually asking. Ask yourself, is it asking for the first action, the root cause, the strongest control, the greatest risk, or the most important governance issue? Once you understand the question itself, the next step is identifying the risk. This is one of the most important parts of the entire exam approach. Before looking for controls or solutions, determine what the actual business risk is within the scenario. After identifying the risk, begin eliminating weak answers. Many questions contain options that are technically correct but not appropriate for the specific situation being described. Others may address symptoms instead of root causes, or focus on operational details rather than governance and risk reduction. Finally, choose the best answer, not simply a possible answer. In many CISA questions, more than one option may appear reasonable. Your task is to identify the answer that best aligns with risk reduction, governance principles, business objectives, audit thinking, and overall impact. A very important mindset throughout the exam is that the best answer is usually the one that most effectively addresses the underlying business risk while following sound audit and governance practices. The more consistently you apply this structured method, the more confident and accurate you will become when handling complex scenario-based questions in the exam. One of the biggest skills in the CISA exam is not just knowing the material. It is learning how to eliminate weak answers quickly and logically. In many questions, 2 or even 3 answers may seem correct at first glance. Your job is to narrow the options down to the best answer. The first thing to remove is overly technical answers. CISA is not primarily testing engineering depth or product-specific expertise. It is testing audit judgment, governance thinking, risk management, and control effectiveness. So if one option is highly technical, while another addresses governance, process, risk, or control objectives more effectively, the governance-focused answer is often the better choice. The next step is removing reactive answers. The exam generally prefers proactive and preventive approaches over reactive ones. For example, preventing an incident is usually stronger than detecting it later. Strengthening governance is usually stronger than responding after failure. Improving controls is usually stronger than fixing symptoms repeatedly. Then remove answers that do not address the root cause. This is extremely important in scenario-based questions. Many options may solve a symptom, but not the underlying issue creating the risk. For example, retraining staff may not solve poor segregation of duties. Adding monitoring may not solve weak access controls. Increasing backups may not solve weak change management. The best answer is usually the one that addresses the underlying control weakness or process failure. Finally, focus on risk alignment. Ask yourself, which option reduces the greatest business risk? Which option aligns best with governance and control objectives? Which option has the greatest overall impact? This elimination strategy helps simplify difficult questions and keeps your thinking aligned with how the CISA exam is designed. The key takeaway is this: do not search for the most technical answer. Search for the answer that best reduces risk, improves control effectiveness, and supports the business objective. As you prepare for the CISA exam, it is important to understand that many candidates do not fail because they lack knowledge. They fail because of how they approach the questions under exam pressure. One of the biggest mistakes is rushing through questions. The CISA exam is heavily scenario-based, and small wording differences can completely change the correct answer. Words like most, best, first, primary are extremely important. A candidate may understand the topic perfectly, but still choose the wrong answer simply because they answered too quickly and missed what the question was actually asking. Another very common mistake is ignoring keywords. The exam writers intentionally use keywords to guide you toward the correct thinking process. For example, first usually relates to sequence or immediate priority. Best usually means the most effective overall option. Primary focuses on the main cause or objective. Most likely focuses on probability and risk judgment. If you miss those keywords, you may select an answer that is technically correct, but not the correct answer for the question being asked. Another major trap is choosing technical answers first. Many candidates, especially those with strong technical backgrounds, naturally lean toward technical fixes. But the CISA exam usually prioritizes governance, risk reduction, process improvement, control effectiveness, business impact, over purely technical solutions. So if you immediately choose the most technical answer, you may miss the stronger governance or risk-based option. And finally, many candidates do not read all the options carefully. Often the first answer looks reasonable, but a later option is broader, more strategic, more preventive, or more aligned to the root cause. Always evaluate every option before making your final choice. The key takeaway from this slide is simple. Slow down, identify the keywords, think like an auditor, and choose the answer that best aligns with risk, governance, and business objectives. One of the biggest mindset shifts required to pass the CISA exam is learning the difference between technical thinking and audit thinking. Many candidates come from highly technical backgrounds, so their natural instinct is to fix systems, configure tools, or troubleshoot technology problems directly. But the CISA exam is not primarily testing whether you can be the best engineer in the room. It is testing whether you can think like an auditor, assess risk, evaluate controls, and support business objectives. A technical mindset usually focuses on fixing the immediate system issue. For example, patch the server, install another security tool, increase firewall rules, deploy more monitoring software. Those actions may help technically, but they do not always address the underlying governance, process, or control problem. An audit mindset starts differently. An auditor first wants to understand: what is the risk? Why did the issue occur? Which control failed? What business impact exists? Is the process effective? That is why audit thinking is usually more strategic and process-focused. A technical response might be, apply another tool. But an audit response might be, improve the process, strengthen controls, clarify accountability, or reduce risk exposure. This distinction appears constantly throughout the CISA exam. In many questions, the technically correct answer is not the best answer. The best answer is usually the one that improves governance, strengthens controls, reduces business risk, addresses root cause, improves process effectiveness. This is especially important in domains 1, 2, 4, and 5. The key takeaway from this slide is simple. When answering CISA questions, do not think like the engineer fixing the technology. Think like the auditor evaluating whether the organization is managing risk effectively. One of the most important exam techniques in the CISA exam is understanding the difference between a root cause and a symptom. The strongest answers in the exam usually address the underlying cause of the problem, not just the visible issue. Weak answers often focus only on symptoms. They may appear technically correct at first, but they do not solve the actual business problem creating the risk. This is a very common CISA exam pattern. For example, a system outage may appear to be the problem, but the real root cause could be weak change management, poor capacity planning, inadequate testing, or ineffective monitoring. Similarly, repeated security incidents may seem like a technical issue, but the root cause may actually be poor governance, lack of policies, inadequate user awareness, or weak access review processes. The CISA exam rewards candidates who think beyond the immediate symptom and identify the deeper control, governance, or process weakness. When approaching exam questions, always ask, what is causing this issue? What process failed? What control weakness allowed this to happen? What business risk is created? This approach helps eliminate weaker answers that only provide short-term fixes. A technical correction may solve the immediate symptom, but unless the underlying cause is addressed, the problem is likely to occur again. This is why auditors focus heavily on root cause analysis, control design, process effectiveness, and governance maturity. The key lesson from this slide is simple. The best answers solve the underlying business and control problem. Weak answers only treat the visible symptom. This slide highlights one of the most important answer selection strategies in the entire CISA exam: understanding the difference between root cause and symptom. In many scenario-based questions, the exam will present you with a visible problem or incident. But the best answer is usually not the one that fixes the visible symptom. It is the one that addresses the underlying cause creating the risk. For example, imagine repeated unauthorized transactions are occurring in a system. A weak answer might be increase monitoring. That may help detect future incidents, but it does not solve why the transactions were possible in the first place. A stronger answer could be, implement segregation of duties, or strengthen access controls. Those answers address the root control weakness causing the issue. Another example might involve repeated system outages. A weak answer may suggest, restart the servers more quickly. But a stronger audit-focused answer may involve, improving change management, strengthening capacity planning, implementing better testing procedures, improving governance over infrastructure changes. Again, the stronger answer addresses why the problem exists, not just how to recover from it faster. This concept appears throughout all 5 CISA domains. The exam constantly tests whether you can identify the real risk, the failed control, the underlying process weakness, the governance gap creating the issue. Weak answers often treat symptoms, react after the fact, focus only on technology, solve short-term problems. Strong answers usually reduce risk at the source, improve preventive controls, strengthen processes, improve governance and accountability. So whenever you face a difficult question, pause and ask yourself, which option fixes the underlying cause of the problem? That is very often where the best CISA answer is found. Recognizing these keywords consistently can significantly improve both accuracy and exam confidence. Now that we have covered how the CISA exam really thinks, the next step is applying these concepts through practice and repetition. The first priority is practice questions. But remember, simply memorizing answers is not enough. Every question should train you to think like an auditor. Identify the risk. Identify the control weakness. Identify the business impact. Determine the best response. The goal is not just getting the answer correct. The goal is understanding why the other answers are weaker. The second focus area is scenario-based thinking. The CISA exam is heavily built around real-world situations and judgment-based decisions. So as you study, always ask yourself, what is the real risk here? Which control failed? What is the root cause? What would an auditor prioritize first? Which option best reduces business risk? The more you practice this style of thinking, the more natural the exam becomes. And finally, full mock exams are essential. They help you build time management, concentration, question analysis skills, answer elimination techniques, confidence under pressure. Mock exams also help identify weak areas across the 5 domains so you can focus your revision where it matters most. The key takeaway from this slide is simple. Passing the CISA exam is not about memorizing thousands of facts. It is about developing structured audit thinking through consistent practice, scenario analysis, and exam-style repetition. And that is where the real confidence begins to build. During the CISA exam, you are absolutely going to encounter difficult questions. That is normal. In fact, Some questions are intentionally designed to test your judgment under pressure rather than your ability to recall information perfectly. The first step when facing a difficult question is to eliminate the obviously wrong answers. Usually, at least one option is too technical, unrelated to the risk, reactive instead of preventive, or simply does not answer the question being asked. By removing weak options first, you immediately improve your odds and make the question easier to analyze logically. The second step is to make the best logical choice based on audit thinking. At this point, ask yourself, which answer best reduces business risk? Which option addresses the root cause? Which control is most preventive? Which response aligns best with governance and process? Remember, the CISA exam is often about choosing the best answer, not a perfect answer. Sometimes two options may both appear reasonable. That is where audit judgment becomes critical. The stronger answer is usually the one that is more preventive, more strategic, more risk-focused, more aligned to business objectives, more governance-oriented. And finally, if you are truly stuck, flag the question and return to it later. Do not allow one difficult question to consume large amounts of time and increase exam stress. Very often, after answering more questions, your mind settles and the earlier question becomes clearer when you revisit it. Another important point is this: there is no negative marking in the CISA exam. Never leave a question unanswered. Even if you are uncertain, use elimination techniques, make the best logical choice you can, and move forward confidently. The key takeaway from this slide is simple. Difficult questions are part of the exam strategy. Stay calm, think logically, eliminate weak answers, and trust structured audit reasoning. As we close this section, these are the key strategies you should carry with you into the actual CISA exam. First, read every question carefully. Many questions are designed to test attention to detail and interpretation, not just technical knowledge. A single word can completely change the meaning of the question. Pay close attention to terms like first, best, most, primary, least likely. These keywords guide the logic of the correct answer. The second strategy is to focus on keywords and context. Ask yourself, what is the real issue? What risk is being described? Is the question asking for prevention, detection, correction, or governance? Is it asking for an action first, or the best long-term solution? The third strategy is one of the most important lessons in the entire CISA journey. Apply logic, not memory. The exam is not simply testing whether you memorize definitions from a textbook. It is testing whether you can think like an auditor in real-world business situations. That means understanding business impact, identifying root cause, evaluating controls, prioritizing governance, making risk-based decisions. Sometimes you may not know the exact technical topic being discussed, but you can still answer correctly using structured audit reasoning. And finally, answer every question. There is no negative marking in the CISA exam. An unanswered question is automatically wrong, while an educated logical choice still gives you a chance to gain marks. Use elimination techniques, apply audit thinking, and make the best decision possible before moving on. The key takeaway from this slide, and really from this entire series, is this: the CISA exam rewards structured audit judgment far more than memorized technical detail. If you learn to think in terms of risk, controls, governance, business impact, process effectiveness, then you are thinking the way the exam expects. As we close this section, these are the key strategies you should carry with you into the actual CISA exam. First, read every question carefully. Many questions are designed to test attention to detail and interpretation, not just technical knowledge. A single word can completely change the meaning of the question. Pay close attention to terms like first, best, most, primary, least likely. These keywords guide the logic of the correct answer. The second strategy is to focus on keywords and context. Ask yourself, what is the real issue? What risk is being described? Is the question asking for prevention, detection, correction, or governance? Is it asking for an action first, or the best long-term solution. The third strategy is one of the most important lessons in the entire CISA journey. Apply logic, not memory. The exam is not simply testing whether you memorize definitions from a textbook. It is testing whether you can think like an auditor in real-world business situations. That means understanding business impact, identifying root cause, evaluating controls, prioritizing governance, making risk-based decisions. Sometimes you may not know the exact technical topic being discussed, but you can still answer correctly using structured audit reasoning. And finally, answer every question. There is no negative marking in the CISA exam. An unanswered question is automatically wrong, while an educated logical choice still gives you a chance to gain marks. Use elimination techniques, apply audit thinking, and make the best decision possible before moving on. The key takeaway from this slide, and really from this entire series, is this. The CISA exam rewards structured audit judgment far more than memorized technical detail. If you learn to think in terms of risk, controls, governance, business impact, process effectiveness, then you are thinking the way the exam expects. Before we conclude, a quick disclaimer regarding this presentation and the examples discussed throughout the series. This content is based on personal experience, professional interpretation, research, and practical understanding developed through working in information security, governance, risk management, and auditing environments. The material is intended purely for educational and learning purposes. Its goal is to help simplify concepts, explain audit thinking, and support students preparing for certifications such as CISA and related governance or security disciplines. This presentation does not represent official guidance, endorsement, or affiliation with any certification body, standards organization, employer, or professional institution. As with all areas of information security, governance, and risk management, practices can vary between organizations, industries, regulatory environments, and frameworks. Viewers are encouraged to perform their own research, review official source material, and apply professional judgment within their own environments. Most importantly, continue learning, questioning, and developing your understanding of how governance, risk, controls, and business processes work together. Thank you for being part of the series.